Penguin Audio presents The Assault on Reason by Al Gore, read by Will Patton. Preface to the 2017 edition. 10 years ago, when I wrote the first edition of The Assault on Reason, I began with the observation that a large and growing number of Americans are asking out loud what has happened to our country. More and more people are trying to figure out what has gone wrong in our democracy and how we can fix it. 10 years later, especially in the wake of the 2016 presidential campaign, this feeling of unease about our democracy has deepened considerably. The assault on reason has not only continued but intensified. At the end of 2016, Oxford Dictionaries declared post-truth as its international word of the year. Not to be outdone, another dictionary, Merriam-Webster, declared surreal as its word of the year. Back in 2006 to 2007, I was extremely concerned that reason was playing a sharply diminished role in the deliberations of representative democracy, and that the time-honored method by which Americans tried to identify the best available evidence and then struggled together to agree on what was more likely than not to be true was having an increasingly hard time of it out in the world. Information that was importantly true, like the scientific consensus on the global emergency of the climate crisis, was simply not finding its way into people's hearts and minds, in part because of large, expensive, and successful disinformation campaigns. Meanwhile, information that was importantly untrue, such as the allegation that Saddam Hussein was responsible for attacking the United States on 9/11, was actually believed by most Americans, and continued to be believed by nearly half of all Americans 5 years later in 2006. I wrote The Assault on Reason not to excoriate the bad actors behind the poisoning of our ecosystem of information, but to explore how that ecosystem has changed in ways that make it so much more vulnerable to such poisoning. Bad actors have always been with us, and always will be, and in any case, my bad actor might be your inspired patriot. For this edition, I have added a substantial new conclusion, which largely uses the 2016 election and the success of Donald Trump's sui generis campaign to try to explain what has happened over the 10 years since this book was first written, and to examine where we can go from here. I admit it doesn't look good. His counselor, Kellyanne Conway, has introduced a new Orwellian label for falsehoods, alternative facts. And even before taking the oath of office, Trump used Twitter to begin a continuing claim that millions of votes in the election were cast fraudulently, despite overwhelming evidence that this isn't so, and absolutely no credible evidence that it is so. His apparent reason is to counter a fear that the mandate he wants attached to his victory in the Electoral College might be undermined if too much importance was assigned to the fact that his opponent won the popular vote by a significant margin. But just as I felt 10 years ago that it was too simple and wrong to focus on George W. Bush as the cause of this crisis in American democracy, I feel the same way now about Donald J. Trump. Indeed, during his campaign, Trump was a harsh critic of Bush, particularly his decision to ignore the CIA's clear warning in August 2001 that Osama bin Laden was planning to imminently attack the United States, and his misleading claim a year later that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, WMD. Ironically, Russian propaganda designed to undermine confidence in the ability of the United States to make good decisions regularly includes the question, what about the claim Iraq had WMD? I wrote about the Bush administration's relationship to the forces of unreason at a moment when the stakes were still high. The grave consequences of that history are, of course, still with us, particularly the destabilization of the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean that predictably followed the tragic invasion of Iraq on false pretenses. Now that some of those passions have cooled,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?